In this game, we see Paul Morphy himself using the Morphy Gambit to defeat Thomas Barnes in a game played in London in 1858. This game will show you most of what you need to know about how to carry out the attack in the Morphy Gambit. Let's remember the starting moves. e4, e5, bishop c4, knight f6. Now we bring our knight out to f3, offering up the e-pawn, and then we offer a trade of knights that black usually accepts. Now black has to do something about his pawn at e5. If he plays the pawn to d6, then he's in deep trouble after knight to g5, and f7 is under a big assault. The same thing happens if he defends with the knight on c6. We go to g5, and again he's got big problems, especially now that our queen controls d5. So, in order to defend the pawn, all the major authorities recommend putting the pawn at f6. Personally, as black, I suggest that you just return the pawn playing c6, and then when the knight captures the pawn, just play d5, and then that white bishop won't worry you anymore. White still has a slightly better game, but black has a completely defensible position. Instead, the recommended f6 weakens the king side, and of course white must now attend to castling. Then black can play something to further support the center, like knight c6, or he can try to bring out the bishop, but that allows for a big sacrifice. White can play knight takes e5. We couldn't do that before castling, because if we did, black could pin the knight by moving the queen in front of the king. But since white is already castled, that's not an option. So now, if the knight is captured, then the queen comes out and gives check. This is a standard trick. And the threat of queen to f7 checkmate means that black has to move the g-pawn, after which white forces checkmate. First picking off the pawn with check, then picking off the rook with check. And now, because white has castled, rook e1 check is available. That's a very important aspect of castling. Black blocks, and now the rook can be sacrificed, because since black's queen is pinned, he must capture with the king. And then the queen comes back and gives check, forcing the king back to d8, and now the bishop comes in to finish things off. Black has no choice but to block, and then checkmate. So, after we castle, black can't afford to bring the bishop out, but must bring the knight out to give further support to e5. Now, because we want to get our queen to h5, we move the knight to h4, and that threatens to bring the queen to h5 with check. Black should now move the pawn up from g7 to g6 to prevent that, but in this game, Barnes tried to defend a different way, bringing the queen in to help with the defense. This is an experiment that hasn't been repeated because Morphy deals with it so effectively. The knight leaps into f5, attacking the queen, and now the queen has to go someplace. There's no point in going home, so the queen comes out and attacks the bishop. Here, Morphy might have advanced the bishop to d5, and then if the knight is challenged, it can go into h6 because it's protected by the bishop at c1. But instead, he chose to calmly retreat the bishop to b3, which is also a good move. Black puts two pawns in the center, fulfilling an opening goal, and it looks pretty good. It looks as though that center is pretty well established. It's protected by a knight at c6, a queen at c5, and a pawn at f6, and on top of that, the bishop at c8 now attacks the knight at f5. All that is true, but at the same time, White has the initiative because he's on the attack, and he can pursue that by going after the queen. Obviously, black is not going to trade a queen for a knight or a bishop, so the queen moves away. And now Morphy decides to retreat the knight back to h4, where it's on the edge of the board, but it does attack the square g6. And now the threat is queen h5 check again. Because black can move the pawn to g6, he's not too worried about it. He correctly plays the bishop to e6, but on the check, he now decides to block with the pawn. Probably the best move for black here is to block with the bishop, and then when the queen moves away, retreat the knight to e7 so that it can go to g6 later. However, if you're playing the white side, there's nothing to complain about after you move your rook to d1. Notice that white has castled and connected the rooks, and so is in a position to attack. Black's position is not too bad here, but it would just be a normal game. Instead, after queen h5 check, Barnes continued with g6, which was a big mistake because white simply captures the pawn. And now the pawn at h7 is pinned, so the knight can't be captured. Barnes had not overlooked this, but realized that he would have the resource bishop to f7, counterpinning the knight and threatening to capture it with the bishop. But Morphy was a step ahead, as the queen retargets at f6. Black captures the knight, white captures the pawn, but notice that white is now attacking the rook in the corner, and the black king cannot castle to safety. The rook cannot be saved, so it moves to g8, and now it's possible for white to give a check at e6, but that check would not accomplish anything right away. So instead, Morphy shows the master touch by bringing one of the rooks into the game, threatening the pawn at d5. This puts black under a lot of pressure, and black is of course concerned about the invading queen, so she gets kicked with bishop to e7, and now moves to e6, where it's not a check, but the rook at g8 is attacked, and black still cannot castle. Of course, black can defend and chase the queen away further by bringing the bishop back, and remember that black is up a knight for a pawn, so he's still pretty happy here. Now the queen goes back. It doesn't look as though white has a tremendous attack here, because white's pieces are all confined to the first three ranks. But notice that those pieces are bishops and the queen, and these are very long distance pieces, so they work effectively from afar. There's an attack at h7, which is not so important, but more critical is the fact that black still cannot castle, so he has to worry about his king. The knight is moved into a defensive position, and now Morphy needs to blast open some lines to continue the attack, and he knows how to do that with f4. Obviously, black isn't going to capture and open up the f-file, so the pawn advances. And now we see the pressure at d5 building, and we notice that the rook as well as the bishop attacks it. And this takes advantage of a weakness of black's position. It looks as though the capture of the pawn is just silly because black has a bishop and a queen there, but notice that the bishop has to be at f7 to defend against a check at h5. So, after the bishop captures the rook, the queen check takes advantage of the pin on the fifth rank. So the bishop cannot retreat because otherwise black would lose his queen. This means that the black king has to move. because blocking with the rook doesn't work. Although it would have been better than moving the king. If he blocks with the rook, you give back the bishop at e5, but still black is well ahead in material, and now could arrange a trade of bishops on the diagonal. So this is not too bad for black, and white would have to break the pin, because if black captures, then white would have the trick bishop f7 check and queen takes h5. So the game would probably have continued queen to a6, getting rid of the pin, rook e1, and then after bishop takes e3, white would not recapture but would play f5, and that's the problem with putting the rook at g6, is the pin on the diagonal. So even though at the moment black has a rook and a knight for white's two pawns, white will recover the rook, and the chances should be about even, but you still have to worry about black's king being exposed, and that rook at e1 might eventually be able to do some real damage on the e-file. So let's go back to the position after queen h5 check. Even though rook to g6 doesn't work because of f5 later on, it still would have been the better move, but Barnes chose to move the king to f8, and now, after capturing, black is still well ahead in material, but only because the bishop at d5 is pinned does black have any real defense against the big attack. Black adds more defense to f7, and white now chases away the queen. Now he doesn't have to worry about the bishop at d5, so the pawn moves forward and threatens to go to f6 with a big fork. Black should have moved the queen to f6 here to prevent that, but instead put the knight at f7, allowing for, because bishop takes f6 seems to be safe, since the bishop is protected by the queen. The problem is that the queen gets knocked around and then has to move to d6 to be able to protect the bishop at f6. And now bishop takes f7 is very strong. Black can't afford to recapture because of bishop c5 pinning the queen to the king. So black had to stop that. And now the bishop goes the other way and pins the rook. The king tries to escape. But now, after the exchange, white is just a pawn up, and the attack is still continuing on the light squares. Some people think that having bishops of opposite colors, as here, leads to drawish positions, but that's not really true, because when you have bishops of opposite colors, then that means that you are free to attack on the squares controlled by your bishop, and the black king really can't survive here. The threat is queen to f7 check, so rook to f8. The rooks get traded here, and the king goes back. Now the bishop is lost, so white is just winning here. Black gets to toss in a few checks, and maybe can hope for a new queen, but there just isn't enough time. The bishop comes in, and now with queen f3 check, checkmate is inevitable. It's mate in 3 in the worst case, as you can figure out for yourself. So black simply resigned here. This was an excellent example of the kind of attack you get when you use the Morphy Gambit as white.